The Right Side with Doug Billings.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Right Side. Doug Billings here on the program today. America is not panicking, but America is under pressure. I think that's obvious. And when pressure rises, power always tells you the same thing, that this is inevitable. So today, I'm going to expose why escalation and fear and urgency are being pushed right now, and why calm, informed Americans are the real threat to unaccountable power. Important topics for an important time, ladies and gentlemen. Education and analysis. The Right Side with Doug Billings is now upon you. Are you ready? Let's go.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hey everybody, my name is General Mike Flynn, and I'm here to do a big shout out for my great friend and one of the best in the business, Mr. Doug Billings. Right Side with Doug Billings, Right Side with Doug Billings. Doug is the future of the airwaves when it comes to independent broadcasters and podcasters. He is the new Rush Limbaugh. He's exactly what America needs right now, looking for honesty, looking for wisdom, looking for truth, looking for patriotism. Listen to Doug Billings at Right Side with Doug Billings. God bless you and God bless America, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are winning. We're winning, winning, winning. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Are you ready?
We are not liberal snowflakes who melt away in the face of tragedy, adversity, and challenge. We are a covenant nation under God, and his divine providence is not dead and it's not gone. It is living within each and every one of you. And you will bring it to life in such a way that the world has never seen before. We never back down. We never give up. We march forward.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Right Side. All right, I'm going to dig into this here, and I'm going to go slow, and I want to slow the moment down. I want to be precise. I want you to listen to this, because if you are listening only to the headlines out there, if you watch the cryon alerts, the nonsense, the breathless commentary, the radical left liberal agenda, all of the talking points that they get together and decide, what are we going to say today? They get together, all of them on the media, and they decide what they're going to say. So if you're watching all of that, if you're listening to only that, you would think that America is on the brink of some sort of immediate collapse, right? She's not. Folks, look, America is not on her deathbed. The radical left will throw everything up at us as far as chaos and events that cause chaos, riots, looting, insurrection, emergencies, unprecedented danger, arson, anarchy, all of it. But here's the question I want to start with today, and it's an important one. Is America actually panicking, or is something else happening out there? Because those two things are not the same, obviously, and confusing them leads to very bad decisions at the top. So I'll be very precise. Americans are not panicking, but we are under pressure. And pressure, when it's sustained, when it's unresolved, that creates anxiety, not hysteria, anxiety. And that distinction matters. Because panic, we all know, looks like sudden irrational behavior, mass breakdowns, the mob, uncontrolled violence, total social collapse, and so forth. And that's not what we are seeing across America. We're seeing pockets of chaos that are brought about in blue states and blue cities. But what we are seeing across, I think, the greater landscape of America and within the state of play within America is something much quieter. Tension, fatigue, distrust, the withdrawal from institutions, the withdrawal, for some of us, if you're honest with yourselves, I think some of us have withdrawn from the institution of the government. We don't vote anymore, and that's a big issue among conservatives. And frustration that has nowhere to go is a problem. But my point is, that's not panic. That's a nation living under a long-term psychological and civil strain. Societies don't break during panic. They break when pressure is mismanaged by those people who are in power. So let's ground it in what's happening right now. Over the last several days, we've watched escalating confrontation brought about by the radical liberal agenda. Evidence of the obvious is sufficient. Between federal law enforcement agitators in Minnesota, we've heard discussions of extraordinary federal authorities being under attack there and elsewhere. We've seen heated rhetoric, and we've seen conflicting narratives between federal officials, local leaders, and media outlets. And immediately, the media jumps to the same conclusion every time. This proves America is coming apart. No, ladies and gentlemen, not at all. It proves something else. It proves that institutions are escalating faster than the public is reacting. And that's a very important signal, because when systems feel confident, they persuade, right? And when systems feel secure, they explain. When systems believe that they're legitimate, they don't threaten. Escalation is not strength. Escalation is a symptom. And here's a rule of history that you can take to the bank. When persuasion stops working, institutions switch to pressure. And pressure always arrives before legitimacy collapses, not afterwards. This is nothing new. And by the way, it's not uniquely American, not even close. And this is not only one party or one headline. This is about how power behaves when it senses resistance. And I'll say some things here that may surprise some people. The presence of federal force discussions does not mean that the public is out of control. It often means that the decision makers believe that something is slipping away from them. That's a very different thing. And where the media seems to me always gets it wrong, whether it's deliberate or not, they assume that the public responds to pressure the same way that institutions do. But Americans don't. Historically, Americans don't riot first. They endure first. They absorb pressure. They work hard. They reassess. And then they pull back from the systems that they no longer trust. That's typically how we react here. We'll start to stop listening before we start shouting. That's the intellectually mature, common American response. The quiet withdrawal terrifies centralized power. And that actually terrifies them a lot more than the loud protest ever could. That's where we need to talk about anxiety, not panic. Anxiety is what happens when rules feel inconsistent for us, or accountability feels selective. You get a hint of that? Enforcement feels political. Explanations stop making sense. And anxiety then is also corrosive. It's not explosive, it's corrosive, and it changes behavior really slowly, anxiety does. People stop believing, they stop participating, they stop granting consent. And here's the danger for institutions. You can command compliance, but you cannot command consent. Consent has to be maintained. That brings us to a critical civic lesson. Remember in the days when they used to teach civics in our educational institutions? Most Americans were never taught this. There is a difference between authority, power, and legitimacy. Authority is granted by law, and our law is comprised of rights that come to us from God. Power is enforced by systems, and legitimacy is granted by the people. You can have authority without legitimacy, and you can have power without trust, but you cannot have a stable republic without consent. And when legitimacy erodes, escalation becomes tempting because it feels like control. But escalation accelerates the very thing that leaders are trying to stop. Now let's apply this to Minnesota. Without hysteria, let's just look at it, because what we're seeing is not a nationwide breakdown. What we're seeing is friction between law enforcement, local political leadership, activist pressure, and the media narrowifies the amplification of this all. The narrative that comes from them, always the amplifier. It doesn't mean that the loudest voices are the majority. In fact, that's not even closely anywhere near the truth. The loudest voices are not the majority. Friction creates heat, doesn't it? And when heat rises, leaders have a choice to make. They can explain it or they can escalate it. And when explanation fails, escalation looks faster, but it's always riskier. That's where Americans in the middle feel it most. Because the average American isn't trying to burn the systems of this country down, ladies and gentlemen. We are trying to raise families, afford groceries, feel safe, trust the law applies every day, and believe that our voice still matters in this republic. That's why anxiety spreads faster than panic, and why it's shouting emergency at the public. If you shout those things, it doesn't calm anything down when we do that. It signals a loss of confidence at the top. And that's what you see in the radical left movement. They have no confidence at the top, so therefore and thereby they create chaos. The mob, riots, looting, arson, anarchy. Let's have some pallets of rocks, bricks, and stones delivered to downtown so that we can throw them through storefront windows. And I'll be clear about something. This is not a call for chaos. Obviously, this is not an endorsement of violence. This is not justification for disorder. It's the opposite. It's an explanation of why disorder becomes tempting to those people who believe that time is running out. History shows us that societies fracture not when citizens panic, but when leaders misread restraint as weakness. American people are not breaking. Americans are waiting. And waiting is a dangerous situation for systems that are built on urgency. So here's the question that institutions should be asking, that I think they should ask, but they won't. They won't. I'll bet you a nickel they won't. What happens if the public doesn't panic, doesn't riot, doesn't comply emotionally, and instead they just stop believing in us? What if the institutions in this country and around the world asked those questions? That's the real fear, not chaos in the streets, but calm resistance. That's the fear, because calm people are very hard to manipulate. And a public that thinks clearly under pressure can't be rushed into surrendering its agency and its sovereignty. And so as we move forward today, I'm going to unpack why escalation is accelerating, why narratives are inflating, while global conflicts are framed as inevitable, and why elections, especially control of Congress, suddenly matters more than ever. But I want to leave you with this before we go on. Panic destroys societies quickly. Pressure destroys them only when the leaders refuse to correct their course. And America has endured pressure before. We've been in worse situations than we are in today. The question isn't whether the people can handle this moment. The question is whether institutions remember who they serve. America is under pressure. It's not under panic. Cue that old David Bowie and Queen song, right? Under pressure. And pressure reveals how power is actually behaving in this country. Now, I want to talk about escalation. Not escalation as a threat. Not escalation as some sort of a liberal slogan, but escalation as a historical and institutional behavior. Because when you understand why escalation happens, you stop being manipulated by it. Over the past several days, Americans have heard serious language, talk of extraordinary federal authority, right? Heightened enforcement posture, warnings about the unrest, and those words are powerful. And powerful words require context, not emotion. Not emotion. So let's slow down and teach something most people never were taught in school. Escalation is not the first move of confident leadership. It is the last shortcut of a leadership that believes time is running out for them. And throughout history, in republics, in empires, democracies alike, escalation follows a predictable pattern. First, the leaders persuade, then they warn, and then they escalate. Escalation doesn't mean the public has lost control. It usually means that leaders believe that they are losing their leverage. And that distinction matters. Look at Iran. Look at Minnesota. Look at the radical liberal left in America. And if you talk specifically about the extraordinary federal powers that are being considered in the United States in various areas, Minnesota key among them, those authorities exist for a reason. They're not imaginary and they're not new. They were designed for rare, extreme, and clearly defined circumstances and situations where states are unable or unwilling to maintain basic order and constitutional guarantees. The founders, they understood something very clearly. A republic has got to be able to defend itself. But it also has to mean normalizing the society. It also, fear has no real use for us. Because when we're in states of emergency powers, once they're normalized, and once this is like common, this is what we expect, they stop being emergency tools and they start becoming governing habits. So here's the civic lesson. The danger of extraordinary authority is not its existence. The danger of it is its frequency. And so when extraordinary measures are discussed, often without being used, it tells you something about institutional confidence. Confident systems don't need to remind the public of their power. They rely on their legitimacy. And that's where escalation language collides with public anxiety, because the average American hears this and they think, well, why are we talking about this if things are supposedly under control? That question is a rational one. And when it goes unanswered, anxiety grows. So let's apply this to what we're seeing, all right, ladies and gentlemen? We're not witnessing a nationwide disorder. It's not a nationwide riot. We're witnessing localized friction being framed as a systemic emergency, and that framing matters. Because when leaders respond to friction with escalation rhetoric, they risk teaching the public that dialogue has failed even when it hasn't been tried. So that's dangerous. And it's a dangerous signal to send in a constitutional republic. And I'll say this carefully and clearly. Explaining the risks of escalation is not the same as opposing law enforcement. It is not endorsing disorder. It is not minimizing violence. It is acknowledging a historical truth. If anything, I'm a student of history. Strong republics resolve tension through legitimacy before force. Force exists as a backstop, not a substitute for trust. Here's another rule of history. Every system that overuses authority eventually reveals that it doesn't trust its own consent. That doesn't mean that collapse is imminent. It means confidence is eroding, and erosion happens quietly before it happens publicly. They worry about this in the back rooms and the hallways of their offices long before they let you catch wind of it. That's why the language around inevitability is so dangerous. When leaders say escalation is inevitable, when officials will suggest to us there are no other options, they're removing agency from themselves and from the public. History shows us something important in that regard. The moment leaders believe that there are no alternatives, they stop looking for better ones. It sounds simple when you say it, but not many people walk through that. Let's talk about misreading restraint. One of the great mistakes that centralized power makes again and again is assuming that a calm public is a passive public. It's not. It is often a calculating public that they're seeing. Americans historically absorb pressure before they respond. Historically, they don't rush into chaos. They don't watch and burn unless they're paid to do it by radical liberals and convinced that they'll be let off the hook because they've got judges who will not press charges and because they've got bail bond funds set up online. We watch and we remember first. We evaluate credibility. And when we move decisively and we move lawfully. That's the difference between conservatism and liberalism. And that's why institutional escalation often arrives too early. It responds to fear inside the system, not behavior outside of it. Does that make sense? That's where anxiety becomes the real risk, is right there. Because anxiety doesn't explode, it accumulates. And accumulated anxiety changes behavior in subtle ways. People disengage. Conservatives, they don't trust the system. The voting system's rigged. I'm not going to vote anymore. A big mistake, but that's what they do. People stop trusting institutions. They turn to alternative voices for information, and they begin to question narratives reflexively. That's not instability, ladies and gentlemen. That's legitimacy with a warning light going on. And I'll put it plainly. If the public were truly on the brink of chaos, leaders wouldn't need to keep on talking about it. Chaos announces itself quite well. And so the constant repetition of crisis language is not evidence of disorder. It's evidence of a narrative strain. The media's got a narrative plan, and they are engaged together across all networks to bring it to you. And here's the hardest truth for institutions to accept. You can't threaten a population back into trust. Trust is restored through transparency, through consistency, and accountability, not urgency. Escalation without explanation doesn't calm anxiety. It validates it. So as Americans watch events unfold in Minnesota and elsewhere, the real question isn't, will authority be used? The real question is, will legitimacy be restored before authority is exhausted? Because history shows us something very, very sobering. Once legitimacy collapses, authority has got to be used more often and works less each time it's used. That's not strength. That's diminishing returns on their power structure and their agenda. It's important, and I want to talk now about the amplifier, because the loudest voices aren't the majority. Escalation rarely stands alone. Escalation almost always arrives with something else, and that is narrative inflation. And the media is all over this. They do it all the time. Once you understand narrative inflation, you start seeing it everywhere, and you can't unsee it. So a simple truth: not every crisis is a collapse. Not every conflict is existential. Not every disagreement that we have is the end of the republic. But if you listened only to the modern media coverage, you'd never know this, because fear has become the default tone. And fear is not accidental. It is efficient. That's how they view it. Here's how the narrative inflation works. When events don't produce the emotional response that institutions expect, the story doesn't change, the tone does. Language escalates even if facts don't. Words like unprecedented, historic, existential, emergency, now or never. They begin to appear everywhere, those words. Not because reality suddenly changed, but because attention has to be maintained. The media needs your attention. This is the first thing that Americans need to understand. Fear is not primarily about informing you. Fear is about controlling the tempo of the information that you get. If you can keep people emotionally activated, you don't have to persuade them. You just have to let them keep on reacting. panic mode. Now, you amplify that, so what we're seeing right now becomes real for us. Localized unrest becomes framed as a nationwide collapse. Police disputes become, moral emergencies. Does this all sound familiar from the radical left? Enforcement friction becomes proof of a systemic failure in our system. And notice something important. The coverage rarely slows down to explain why something is happening. It just accelerates because explanation calms people down, and calm people start asking inconvenient questions. And this is where anxiety grows. Because Americans aren't stupid, ladies and gentlemen. They notice when the volume doesn't match the reality that they're living in. And they notice when everything is treated like a final chapter. And over time, that creates a gap between lived experience and narrated reality. And the gap is where trust erodes, between what the narrative is being told us and what reality shows me. In between there, trust just is decimated. It's just destroyed. And I'll put it plainly. If everything is an emergency, then nothing is. And when real emergencies arrive, credibility has already been spent. It's one of the most dangerous side effects of narrative inflation. It exhausts the public emotionally. But they want you exhausted because exhausted people are easier to control. So you talk about coordination without conspiracy. This theme, this term that I've come up with, coordination without conspiracy. And this matters because the moment that you point out similarities in the media language, people rush to extremism. So let's stay grounded, okay? We're taking emotion out. What we're seeing is not necessarily secret meetings or hidden memos. It's something simpler, but at the same time more troubling. It's incentive alignment. Outlets compete for attention, fear captures attention, and urgency keeps viewers watching. So over time, language coverages, not because everyone planned it, but because the system rewards the same behavior. And that's why you hear identical phrases repeated across the networks. That's why the same framing appears everywhere at once. That's why nuance disappears, and nuance slows momentum. Well, they don't want the momentum slowed. They want to accelerate it. Momentum is the product. Historical lessons. In healthy societies, media acts as a translator between institutions and the public. In stressed societies, media becomes an accelerator for that institutional anxiety that we feel sometimes. Instead of asking hard questions, it amplifies the pressure. Instead of clarifying complexities, it simplifies everything into fear. And here's the irony, ladies and gentlemen. The more fear is pushed, the less effective it becomes because people adapt. They emotionally withdraw. They stop reacting the way they were supposed to act. And when that happens, institutions misinterpret it as apathy or extremism, disinterest, hopelessness, whatever, instead of what it really is, disengagement. Disengagement is way more dangerous to legitimacy than protest. Protest still believes that the system can hear you. Disengagement believes that it can't. And once people disengage, shouting louder doesn't bring them back. It drives them further away. That's why anxiety in this country is rising, not because Americans believe collapse is imminent, but because they feel like it's like they're being talked at, not spoken to. They sense urgency without explanation and pressure without accountability and emotion without any clarity out there. So I'll give you a mental filter that you can use. Whenever you hear coverage framed like, there is no alternative, this has got to happen right now, delay is dangerous, questioning is irresponsible. When you hear something like those things, just pause a minute, ladies and gentlemen, breathe, because historically those phrases appear when confidence is lowest, not its highest. They are not the language of strength. They are the language of narrative defense. Now, here's where this ties directly into places like Minnesota and others around the country. When unrest, even localized unrest, is immediately framed as existential danger, it serves two purposes. Number one, it justifies the escalation. Number two, it discourages scrutiny, because scrutiny takes time and urgency eliminates time. That doesn't mean that nothing is happening. It means not everything is happening. It means that not everything happening is what it is being presented as. And discerning that difference, discernment in general, is the responsibility of a free people. And this is very important. Clarity is not complacency. Questioning is not extremism. And calm analysis of a situation is not denial. Those labels are used when institutions feel challenged by thinking citizens. And the founders understood that dynamic very deeply. They knew that fear could be weaponized. They knew emergencies could be manufactured. And that's why they built systems designed to slow decisions down, not speed them up. And that applies to justice. Deliberating was not a bug. It was the feature of their republic. So when you see relentless urgency, every disagreement framed as a crisis, when every event is treated as destiny, understand that you're witnessing not collapse, but a narrative strain. Here's the takeaway. Americans are anxious because the volume is too high, the explanations are too thin, the accountability feels selective, and the urgency never ends. And anxiety doesn't disappear when you shout out it. It disappears when clarity returns. What do Americans historically do when pressure rises or the narratives inflate and institutions escalate? Because that's where the story always turns. Here's the mistake that many analysts make. They assume that pressure automatically produces chaos. But that assumption comes from studying unstable societies, not the American one. America behaves differently than all of the other societies out there, not because Americans are better people, more moral people, or somehow genetically superior, not at all, but because America was built with pressure in mind. Remember something fundamental. The United States was not created during a moment of calm. She was born out of prolonged uncertainty, economic pressure, political intimidation, propaganda, enforcement without representation. Does all that sound familiar? The founders didn't design the system to work only when everybody felt good. They designed it to work when people felt squeezed. And here's the historical pattern. When pressure rises in America, people don't immediately revolt. They do three things in order. They observe, they withdraw their trust, and they reassert agency. Lawfully. Key word. We do it lawfully. We don't riot. We don't commit arson and anarchy. And that process takes time, and it confounds the centralized systems. They expect immediate emotional reaction from us. That's why anxiety is often misread as weakness. But anxiety is not surrender, it is evaluation. And evaluation is dangerous to systems that rely on urgency. Americans under pressure do not abandon self-government. They test whether self-government still exists. And that's a crucial difference. That people in America, we ask, does the law apply equally here anymore? Do explanations match the outcomes that we see? Are decisions reversible? Does my voice still matter? When the answer feels unclear, trust is put on pause for a moment. Not forever, but deliberately. That's where accountability comes in. And accountability is the only thing that narrative inflation can't survive, because accountability slows things down. It forces explanations. It invites comparisons between words and actions that are out there, and it restores the legitimacy when it is used honestly. Now, this is where escalation enters the conversation, and I want to be very careful how I frame this. Elections are not emotional releases. They are pressure valves. They are the constitutional mechanism for resolving tension without violence, without chaos, without escalation, right? When elections are trusted, societies stabilize. When elections are dismissed, delayed, or trivialized, pressure seeks other outlets. That's why control of legislative bodies matters so much at moments like this. Not because of slogans, but because legislatures are where oversight happens, funding is controlled, policies are constrained, emergency powers are questioned. In other words, legislators and legislatures are where escalation meets resistance. That's why institutions rely on urgency. Often, when they rely on it, often they try to minimize the importance of our elections or frame them as dangerous, because elections return agency to the public, and agency is the opposite of fear. So let's connect directly to what Americans are feeling right now. People sense something is off in this country. I feel it, you feel it, but we are not breaking. We are watching to see who tells the truth, who explains instead of threatens, right? Who respects the process, who remembers limits. Limits, that's not extremism. That is civic maturity, ladies and gentlemen. And here's the part no one in the media wants to say out loud. The most destabilizing thing for a centralized power is not protest. It is a calm, informed electorate that refuses to be rushed. Don't rush yourself into believing you've got to see a perp walk. Don't rush yourself into thinking we've got to begin to see arrests. Because once people stop reacting emotionally, the narratives that the radical liberal movement throws at us with help from the media begin to lose their leverage. That's why history favors patience over panic. Every major American correction came after a period of pressure. The Revolution, the drafting of the Constitution, our Reconstruction, the Civil Rights era, post-Watergate reforms. None of those were instant reactions. They were slow reassertions of principle. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. Not for America, but for institutions that misunderstand America. They believe anxiety means collapse is coming. But historically, anxiety is the prelude to reorganization, not destruction. And here's a grounding truth. America does not fall apart quickly. It corrects, and it corrects itself slowly. That slowness frustrates those who want immediate compliance, immediate answers, but that slowness protects our liberty. So if you're feeling tension right now, if you sense pressure but not panic, if you feel like something is changing but not exploding, you're not wrong. You're living through a moment of reassessment in this country. And reassessment is where republics either renew themselves or they reveal what they've forgotten. So not all bad. There is hope in there. But I want to turn the corner right now, because the real question isn't what's happening. The real question is what happens next, and who decides what happens next. Here's where history becomes our guide again, because every time Americans experience prolonged pressure, not explosions, not revolution, but sustained strain, right? The next phase is not chaos, it's agency. Now, I've mentioned that word a few times today. Agency doesn't show up the way that Hollywood depicts it. It doesn't arrive with mobs. It doesn't arrive on the schedule of CNN or other social media platforms. It arrives with reorganization. Anxiety is a signal. It tells people that old assumptions don't fit into the current reality. When anxiety spreads, people begin doing three things very quietly. They stop outsourcing their judgment, they stop trusting narratives by default, and they start paying attention to process instead of personalities. That's not apathy, that is called awakening. That's why institutions fear anxiety. Oh, the institutions are afraid of anxiety more than they are of anger. Anger can be redirected, and anxiety produces questions. And questions slow down the momentum of the left. Now, this is where accountability enters the picture, not a buzzword, but as a mechanism. Accountability is how free societies convert anxiety into reform. Without accountability, anxiety curdles. Without accountability, anxiety clarifies. So what does accountability actually look like? It's not slogans. It's not performative outrage. It's not endless investigations that go nowhere. Real accountability has four features: transparency, limits, consequences, reversibility. If a system resists those four things, it's telling you something. So you connect that to political structure, because structure is where agency becomes real. The founders didn't expect the public to solve problems emotionally. They expected the public to solve problems institutionally. That's why power was divided. That's why legislatures exist. That's why elections matter more during pressure than during prosperity. Elections are not celebrations, ladies and gentlemen. They are corrections. They are how a republic says, this direction isn't working. We should adjust. And when elections lose their corrective function, pressure has nowhere lawful to go. That's when systems destabilize. This is why control of Congress, especially the House of Representatives, matters so much at moments like this. Not because of party slogans, but because the House controls funding, oversight, investigations, limits on executive behavior. In other words, the House is where escalation meets constraint. And this is why political participation always rises after periods of anxiety, not panic. People don't rush the system. They re-enter it deliberately. They vote differently. They support challengers. They want political outsiders, populist candidates. They get involved locally. They scrutinize and vet incumbents and new candidates. That's not extremism, ladies and gentlemen. That's constitutional self-government doing its job. Now, here's where some people get uncomfortable, because agency requires effort. I call it determined patriotism, doing the hard work of it all. It requires resisting the temptation to react emotionally every time you read the headlines. And that, admittedly, is not always easy. It requires understanding that change is usually incremental, not cinematic, not a movie. Here's where many institutions miscalculate their approach. They believe that pressure is going to exhaust you into compliance. But American history shows the opposite. Pressure clarifies priorities. And clarity produces resolve. You become determined in your patriotism. Think about it. The public here in America, we're not asking for utopia. We're asking for consistency. We're asking for fairness. We're asking for transparency. How about some restraint? What about some accountability? Those aren't radical demands. Those are Republican ones. That's why attempts to frame anxiety as extremism fails every time, because extremism seeks destruction and anxiety seeks correction. What about globally? What if we look out globally, watching systems strain under the same pressures, centralization versus sovereignty? bureaucracy versus accountability, narratives versus reality. America's not isolated from this, but America has an advantage that most systems don't. We built correction mechanisms into the design. They are not perfect, they're slow, but they exist. And that brings us to probably the most important point of this segment of the show. The future is not decided by those who shout the loudest. It's decided by those who stay engaged the longest. Endurance beats urgency, and clarity beats getting it done faster, and process beats panic. So if you're feeling anxiety right now, understand something, that feeling this is not a weakness, it's information. It's telling you that something needs reassessment, and reassessment is how republics renew themselves. Well, I think this is, I think it's very important, and the global pattern is out there as well. Understanding the pattern out there is different between being informed and emotionally steered. Take your emotions out. What about the word inevitable? We're told that conflict is inevitable. Global instability is inevitable. Economic pain is inevitable. That word shows up at very specific moments if we look back in history, and it's never accidental. The first thing Americans need to understand, inevitability is not description. It is a persuasion tactic. When leaders or institutions say something's inevitable, they're not telling you what will happen. They are telling you what they don't want debated. Historically, inevitably appears when three things happen at once. Old systems stop producing results. New pressures expose structural weaknesses, and accountability becomes unavoidable. At that point, inevitability language serves a purpose. It shuts down alternatives. So let's talk about global pressure, because across the world we are seeing nations reassert their borders, trade used as leverage, energy weaponized, currencies questioned, alliances strained, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is not chaos. That is called realignment. And realignment always feels unstable before it feels settled. And the critical mistake that many analysts make, they assume global systems exist because they are permanent. They're not. They are not, ladies and gentlemen. Global systems exist because nations allow them to exist. And when those systems stop serving national interest, nations have to reclaim then their authority. That's not radical. That's normal. This is what people mean, often without realizing it, I grant you, but when they talk about a sovereignty era, and I believe we're entering into one, it's not isolation, not withdrawal, it is a priority. Nations are beginning to say our first obligation is to our people. And that statement terrifies centralized systems, because centralized systems depend on distance from accountability. Now, here's where inevitability narratives come in. When sovereignty rises, centralized authority responds in predictable ways. It labels reassessment as instability, and it warns of catastrophe if they lose control. In other words, it tells you there's no alternative. History proves there are always alternatives, ladies and gentlemen. Always. Now, the alternatives may be uncomfortable, they may require some reforms, and they may reduce centralized power, but they exist, and they're debated, unless debate is intentionally shut down. So let's come back to America. When Americans are told that an economic pain is unavoidable, that reinforcement chaos is unavoidable also. That global conflict is unavoidable also. That all of those alsos come into play, from the radical left usually. They try to condition us to accept outcomes without consent. And that's the opposite of self-government, ladies and gentlemen. That's why inevitability language fuels anxiety, because people can sense when choices are being removed rhetorically. They know the difference between difficulty and inevitability. Difficulty invites problem solving. Inevitability demands that you submit. Every major global realignment was preceded by warnings that change would be disastrous to us. And those warnings almost always came from institutions that benefited most from the old way of doing things. Well, that doesn't make them evil, it makes them predictable. And that's why Americans need to think carefully right now. Not emotionally, strategically, because global pressures create two possible paths. One path centralizes control to manage instability. The other decentralizes authority to restore legitimacy. History shows us which ones last. Decentralization, my friends, is messy. It is slower, it's harder to manage, but it's more resilient. Centralization is efficient until it isn't. And when it fails catastrophically. That's why sovereignty is returning to us worldwide, not because people hate cooperation, but because cooperation without accountability collapses. Now, here's the part that affects you directly at home. Folks, when global systems strain, domestic pressure increases. Why is that? Because leaders try to compensate for external instability with internal control almost every time. That's when enforcement expands. That's when narratives become harder. And that's when dissent is reframed as danger for these people. This is why Americans have got to understand that the global context in which all of this operates and in which we are a part, like it or not. Not to panic, doesn't mean that we panic, but to recognize patterns. Patterns tell you where things are, tells you where things are going before the headlines do. And here's the pattern that we're in right now. Global systems are being questioned. National authority being reclaimed. Notice this. And institutions are resisting that loss of control. Narratives are intensifying across the media. That combination always precedes political realignment. Now, the good news, and it's very important good news, realignment does not mean collapse. It means adjustment. And America has adjusted like this before. And it's done it repeatedly, not just once or twice. Elections, laws, reforms, all of that, reassertion of limits on power, we have repeatedly adjusted in the American life. That's the advantage, really, of a constitutional design that we have here. The danger isn't change that's happening. The danger is pretending change isn't happening and trying to manage it with fear instead of leadership, which is what the liberals do. So when you hear the word inevitable, pause a minute and ask, who benefits from being unquestionable? What alternatives are being ignored out there? And why right now? Because those questions don't weaken our society, ladies and gentlemen. They strengthen it. The future is not inevitable. It is negotiated. And haven't we seen a master negotiator in the White House lately? Negotiation requires informed citizens who refuse to be rushed. And I think we'll look at things like that. We talk about why citizen engagement scares the hell out of centralized power. It really does. More now than ever in a lot of ways. Because the question isn't just what's happening out there. The question is, why does an informed citizen and why does informed citizen engagement suddenly feel threatening to people who are in centralized power structures? Well, the hard truth is that power is most comfortable when citizens are either apathetic or angry. Apathy can be ignored. Your anger can be redirected and manipulated. But if you're engaged, you see, an informed and deliberate and persistent engagement in our process, that's disruptive to the establishment because it slows down their momentum, right? And momentum is what centralized systems rely on. So, I mean, we need, it might sound ridiculous, but we do need to define what we mean by engagement because that matters. Engagement, ladies and gentlemen, is not outrage. It is not performative posting, political theatrics. It's not reacting to every headline. Engagement is participation in a process. It's asking questions like, who has authority here? Or who sets the limits on authority? Who oversees the enforcement in this situation? Who controls the funding? Or sometimes most importantly, who can say no to this? Because those questions make systems uncomfortable. They especially make left-leaning systems uncomfortable because, my friends, they force accountability. This is where elections come back into focus again, not as theater, not as a personality contest, but as mechanisms, which is what they are intended to be by our founders. Elections are the constitutional tool that converts public concern into lawful constraint. That's why they matter most when pressure is at its highest. And I'm going to say this very plainly. When citizens disengage, power will consolidate. And when citizens re-engage, power is dispersed, which is what we want. That's not ideology, by the way. That is institutional physics. This is why legislative bodies matter so much in moments like this, ladies and gentlemen. It's why we have got to get engaged as conservatives. Legislatures are not glamorous, I grant you. They are slow, they're messy, they're frustrating, but that's exactly why they exist. They're designed to absorb pressure without, by the way, breaking the system, right? Something that the media would rarely try to explain to you, if at all. Executive power is very fast. We can see that with President Trump. Legislative power is slow. And slowness is not a flaw in our republic. It is a safeguard. So when anxiety rises, centralized systems prefer speed. Speed, you see, avoids scrutiny. Speed avoids debate. And speed, ladies and gentlemen, avoids accountability. But free societies choose restraint, and they choose process, and they choose deliberation, even when it's uncomfortable and takes time. This is why citizen engagement feels threatening to us right now. Not because people are violent, no, but because they are asking structural questions. They're not just reacting to events and headlines, they're asking, who decides all of this? And that's a dangerous question for any system that's grown accustomed to operating without any challenge. And now we have to talk about misdirection because it is everywhere out there. When we as citizens begin focusing on process, we get told, sometimes very often, don't question that, just trust the process. Don't slow down, just act. Don't debate, comply. Let's get on with it. Well, those phrases, they're not signs of confidence, not at all. Those are signs of institutional impatience. And another historical truth that I would like to point out, that I have to point out, the moment power starts resenting oversight is the moment that oversight becomes most necessary. Healthy systems welcome questions. Stressed systems label questions as threats. Now, let's connect. I want to connect this to why turnout and participation matter. Without any hype, without any slogans. You all have heard me talk about this in terms of what I call determined patriotism, the hard work of getting involved in our process of government at your local level. Participation is not about winning every single battle that we're in. It's about rebalancing initiatives. When leaders know that they're going to be reviewed or constrained or replaced, if necessary, their behavior changes. Maybe not overnight, but it happens measurably. You can tell. That's why the founders emphasized representation. They understood that fear can be managed, but accountability has got to be enforced. So here's what citizen engagement actually does. It tells institutions decisions are reversible. Authority is conditional. Power is always temporary, and legitimacy has got to be maintained. Those signals stabilize societies. They don't destabilize them, like the liberals would have us believe. They stabilize them. Now, let's talk about a misconception that's out there. Our engagement does not guarantee outcomes. It guarantees process. And process is what prevents pressure from turning into a rupture. That's why, efforts to discourage participation in our system often increase during times of anxiety. People are told, your vote doesn't matter. The system's rigged. Nothing ever changes. Remember, there are people out there that say back after 2020, there were tier 1 level people who claimed to be patriots, saying that they weren't going to vote in a rigged system. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the most anti-American statement anybody could ever make. We never abandon our rights that come to us from God. Never. Of the rights that we have, life, of course, is the most sacred, but voting is right there second. One of the most sacred rights, and people are out there trying to convince other conservatives to not engage in a rigged system. 100,000% un-American. We always engage in the rights that God has given us as conservatives. I grant you there is fraud. There are problems. We never surrender our rights that come to God, because that does not honor God. And it doesn't honor the military who have gone to the battlefield and died to protect your rights. So those kind of messages don't empower us. And immobilization benefits the centralized control. It doesn't benefit us. If they get us to freeze out or freeze ourselves out of the system, if they get us to disengage, they win. And I got to be very clear. Cynicism is a gift to unaccountable power. Hope doesn't have to be naive, but resignation is always exploited. And oh, do they want cynicism to roost upon you. It is one of their most famous and most desired demons, if they can just get you to become cynical enough to sit out. That's why Americans right now have a unique advantage. We don't have to invest in new mechanisms. We don't have to burn anything down. We don't have to accept inevitability. We already have constitutional levers, and they work when they are used. And here's the quiet reality that nobody wants to admit, really. When citizens engage calmly and persistently, escalation loses its leverage, folks, because escalation depends on urgency. And engagement depends on patience. So if you're feeling anxiety right now, here's the correct translation. It's not telling you to panic. It's telling you to pay attention, to process, to structure, to accountability. Free societies don't survive because the people within them feel calm. They survive because people stay involved. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, involvement is not loud. It's not even consistent. But it almost always is. Not always, but almost. Involvement is informed. Involvement is lawful. And involvement, ladies and gentlemen, is incredibly powerful. Incredibly so. Because if there's one word that explains the entire moment that we're in, I think better than any headline, it's legitimacy. We've talked about pressure versus panic. We've talked about escalation and that narrative, inflation, and so forth. We've talked about inevitability language, and we've talked about agency, engagement, and accountability. And it all points back to one central truth. Power without legitimacy can function for a while, but it never, ever lasts. Legitimacy is not popularity, by the way. It's not polling numbers. It's not volume. Legitimacy exists when people believe a system and acts within its limits, explains its decisions. Legitimacy exists when people believe that a system applies rules consistently and that it can be corrected peacefully when those conditions are not met. Pressure will then dissipate. When all of those conditions aren't met and we don't start meeting them, the pressure will begin to accumulate. That's why escalation is such a tell. Escalation signals that legitimacy is being managed and not maintained, and there's a difference. A managed legitimacy always fails because legitimacy is not something you can enforce. It's something you earn, and you have to earn it continuously. Now let's talk about correction, because this is where hope actually belongs. Correction is not collapse. Correction is the mechanism that prevents collapse. And every durable system has one. In America, correction is constitutional. And here's something that we forget all too often. The founders did not design a perfect system. They designed a self-correcting system. They assumed mistakes would happen, and they assumed power would overreach, and they assumed pressure would rise. So they built in release valves. And those release valves, they're not dramatic, they're procedural. And ladies and gentlemen, they are slow. And sometimes they're frustrating. Many would say oftentimes they're frustrating. But they work when they are respected. This is why moments like this feel uncomfortable to us, because correction always feels uncomfortable to those benefiting from the status quo. Correction forces questions. Correction forces explanation. And correction forces humility. And here's the part no one in centralized power wants to admit to you. Correction does not weaken a republic, it strengthens it. Because correction renews legitimacy. Now, what happens when correction is resisted? Well, take a look at my favorite thing, history, because we'll get the answer to that question there too. When correction is blocked, whether it's delayed or it's delegitimized, pressure seeks alternative outlets. Not immediately, not explosively, but inevitably. That's why discouraging engagement is so dangerous for us, because engagement is how correction happens lawfully in our country. When people are told their participation doesn't matter, legitimacy erodes faster. And when legitimacy erodes, escalation accelerates. The future doesn't belong to those who manufacture fear and peddle it to us. The future belongs to those who manage pressure wisely and with wisdom, capital W, wisdom from the Holy Spirit. We're living in a moment where steadiness is revolutionary. Imagine that, where refusing to panic is an act of independence. Where thinking clearly is a form of resistance. That's why calm citizens are so disruptive to manipulative systems, because calm citizens cannot be rushed. They can't be stampeded, and they can't be emotionally cornered. That's why the loudest voices will usually fade first. Folks, volume is not durability. Urgency is not authority. Spectacle is not strength. Here's another historical observation I want to leave you with that has never, ever failed. Societies that endure are not the ones that react fastest. They're the ones that correct themselves most faithfully. So, if you're feeling pressure right now, understand something important. You are not witnessing a collapse. America is not on her deathbed. You are witnessing a test of legitimacy in many ways, and tests reveal weaknesses, but they also create opportunities to restore trust. So the questions ahead, not whether America survives. I know she will. History already answered that question. The question is how legitimacy is restored. Through accountability, through participation, through lawful correction, and through clarity over fear. And folks, that path is not glamorous and sexy. It doesn't trend well on social media. It doesn't generate a lot of clicks, but it works, and it always has. The future favors the steady, my friends. It favors the informed, and it favors the patient. And most of all, I would put it to you, the future favors citizens who understand what self-government is not a feeling. Self-government is a responsibility. Look, head over to YouTube, will you? Follow me over there. There's 100,000 people over there. They want to see you over there. Follow me on YouTube at The Right Side Doug Billings, at The Right Side Doug Billings, because after all, and as I always tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we are in this together. Believe it, for the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the set of my show, Doug Billings. Hey, my good friends at EMP Shield, that's electromagnetic pulse, in case you're from Raytown, Missouri. Electromagnetic pulse could wipe out your home electrical system, could wipe out your vehicle. And thanks to the radical liberal agenda that was put forth under Administrator Biden and Vice Pretender Harris, there are lots of people in this country who want to do us harm. And maybe an EMP device would be their chosen weapon. But EMP Shield gives you a device that can protect you. This little baby here goes on your home outlets, a computer, a router, whatever you want to protect. And then they also have a larger model like this. You can still hold it in the palm of your hand that goes on your vehicle battery so that you can get out of trouble from point A to point B. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug, ladies and gentlemen. Save yourself. Save your property. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug. We're in this together, folks. Believe it. For the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.